Hello, this is Mr. Amos, and this is the first PowerPoint in our first unit, which looks at roughly the first 100 years of American history. This first one that we're going to be looking at is going to focus on the American Revolution, a few years before that, and a few years after that, in the early years of the Republic. Now, what you should have out right now, if you're going to be taking notes off of this video, is either a folded up sheet of paper like you've seen in the directions for PowerPoints, or have the digital one ready to go as we follow along here in our notes. Now, one of the things you guys need to make sure you do is put the title of today's PowerPoint as well as the title of each slide as we go along. Where we pick up American history is right at the point where the British government decides to begin taxing the colonists. Now, why was this necessary? Previous to what we're looking at here, the British had been involved in what was called the French Indian War. This was war over territory in North America. And as a result of that war, the British Treasury, their money had been depleted. Now, up until this point, the arrangement between the British government and the American colonists was one of kind of give and take. We had the British government providing military protection. The American colonists provided raw natural resources for industries back in the British government. For example, wood, cotton, tobacco, those things would be then shipped back to England and then turned into finished goods and then sent back to the Americas and sold to them. The French Indian War depleted the British government's treasury, and as a result, they needed to build that back up. And the trade that currently existed between them and the American colonists was not enough to do that. And so essentially what they do is they begin to, for the first time, tax the colonists. Now, the reason why this was such a dramatic step was because they had never done it before. They had never taxed the colonists before. They had taxed themselves for their own small local reasons, but they had never been taxed by the British government located clear back in England. And so for the first time, what begins to happen is the British colonists in the Americas start to see themselves differently than what they had before. They start to see themselves as separate from the British back in England. And when we look at the new taxes, one of them, of course, being the Stamp Act, the Stamp Act seemed absolutely ridiculous because it taxed everything from legal documents to playing cards, which means it basically ticked off everybody from the people working down at the docks to lawyers. The other thing that it did was that it threatened to take people's rights away if they violated this Stamp Act. And so right off from the very beginning, taxation seemed to be a bad sign as to what was going to happen between the British government and the colonies. And as a result, we get this famous saying that you see down at the bottom there, and that is, no taxation without representation. This really came from the fact that the British government did not have representatives from the colonies in their parliament. And this seemed like a big slap in the face to the colonists. So right from the very beginning, the Americans begin to resist these various taxes that the British are trying to impose on the colonists. This should be very relevant for what we're seeing today when we see protests happening around the country. Well, this country seemed to be founded on a tradition of protesting what you believe to be right. Well, at this point, this is really what was going on in the Americas at this point, and that was these various protests. The protests were so vigorous that Parliament actually retracted some of their taxes. However, they turned right around and ended up passing what was called the Coercive Acts in 1774. These coercive acts basically said that the British government had the right to do whatever they wanted to with the British colonists, and the colonists had no say in the matter. To the colonists, this seemed one step from slavery. The colonists had always had a tradition where they believed that they were protected under what was called the British Bill of Rights, and that is, all their citizens have certain rights. Now it seemed that the British government, whenever they felt like it, could take away those rights if it suited them. After repeated attempts to try and iron this out, the colonists realized that they were going to have to band together to try and solve this. They were not going to solve this one colony at a time. And so in 1774, the Patriots, as they now were calling themselves, formed their own, what they called a Continental Congress. Basically, they wanted to do this so they could better communicate with Great Britain in a way that made them appear much more united, but at this point united in their desire to maintain the relationship with Great Britain, not to break it. And so they formed the Continental Congress primarily as a measure to try and maintain relations with Great Britain. However, it was also being used as a way of communicating their problems, their complaints. The British government, however, did not see the Continental Congress as a legitimate governing body to be dealt with. In fact, they threatened that if it didn't disband, that they would begin sending in troops. And in fact, that is eventually what happens. Where things really begin to escalate is where the British begin sending in troops, as we just mentioned. And this is to enforce British laws. And as soon as the troops show up, it confirms the colonists' worst fears, and that is that the British government is willing to use force to force them to follow these laws that they did not have a voice in making. And where this escalates into open conflict is where the British send a group of troops up to this part of Massachusetts called Lexington and Concord. These are two little towns up there. Word had gotten out that the colonists, now calling themselves the Patriots, had a store, a stash, if you want to call it, of arms, guns and ammunition. The British went up there to take that away. Now, one of the rights that are guaranteed to British citizens under the British Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, is that people have the right to bear arms. And so it's at this point that we have Paul Revere's famous ride when he yells through the streets, "The British are coming, the British are coming." And these colonists step out into the field facing off against the British Army. Now I want you to check this out. You're some country boy who has basically pulled your dad's shotgun off out of the gun rack. You are now facing off with the best trained, best armed, and best led army in the world at that time, the British Redcoats. And of course, at some point in this struggle, or in this standoff, a gun goes off. And no one knows who really shot it. Was it a British officer who got a little nervous and the gun dropped? Was it one of the Minutemen, as they call themselves, one of the colonists who was facing off against them, who, dropped that shotgun, dropped that gun, and it went off by accident? Who knows? The fact of the matter is that it goes off, and there is now shooting. The colonists are actually able to fight off for a short time the British soldiers. It's at this point that the Continental Congress meets again and tries to argue with the British king, hey, look, we're supposed to have rights. Those rights are being taken away. We need to reestablish those rights. And when the British king responds, it's obvious that that is not the case. And so it's at this point that the American colonists announce their independence. And this, of course, is Thomas Jefferson's famous Declaration of Independence that is written in 1776. Something that a lot of people don't know is that the American Revolutionary period is not just the American Revolutionary War. A lot of people don't understand that the American Revolutionary period lasted for almost over 20 years, starting with the protest against taxation in the 1760s and then extending clear until the end of the American Revolutionary War, the War for Independence, which, by the way, lasted for 7 years by itself, making it America's longest war until Vietnam, starting in the 1960s, that America would fight. So for 7 long years, Americans fight for their independence. And thanks to an alliance they get from the French, one of the British old enemies, they are able to win their independence. However, this war really is won by way of convincing the British government that it's just not worth it to continue fighting this war so far away from the British homeland, and with colonists who are hell-bent on breaking away from the British government. So eventually it becomes a case of, okay, fine, we give up, you have your independence. But there are some startling military victories along the way. The famous Battle of Saratoga in 1777 is the battle that the American forces win that convince the French that the Americans actually have a chance at winning. And it's after that battle that the French come in on America's side. The next big battle, also on the East Coast, is the battle at Yorktown. Yorktown is this wonderful battle where George Washington finally has an army he can take toe-to-toe with the British Redcoats. And in this battle, he essentially traps the British against the sea. And he is able to definitively beat them once and for all and force them from the North American continent. In a treaty that's signed, the Americans get quite a bit of territory that extends far beyond the western boundaries of the existing American colonies. And so this really begins to open up the West to American expansion, and of course would eventually lead to Americans populating and taking the entire North American continent, or at least all the way to the West Coast. With the American Revolutionary War won, the Americans now had to decide what kind of government that they were going to have. And what's interesting to note at this point is that when the American Revolutionary War began, there really wasn't any long-term plans for the Americans to have a unified country, all 13 colonies, now states, part of some unified union. That was not originally part of it. Instead, what happens is all 13 colonies sign what you see here called the Articles of Confederation, which really was kind of an emergency government to keep the colonies together just long enough for them to win the war. There really wasn't any plan for what would happen after that. One of the things that the Articles of Confederation failed to do was to create any kind of strong unified government that was going to hold these 13 states together. There really wasn't anything long-lasting that was going to hold them together. The Articles of Confederation had no power to tax, it had no power to raise an army. One of the things that they had to do, if they could do anything, was they had to have a unanimous vote on anything. If there was just one vote against, whatever was being decided would be voted down. And even after they agreed on anything, they didn't really have any power over the states. Once they decided on something, they had to ask the states whether or not they would follow the decision that the Confederation government had decided upon. And so it becomes very obvious early on to these early Americans that the Articles of Confederation was not going to be a strong enough government to hold these 13 states together once the war was done. So once the war was done, the states now looked at each other going, well, okay, well, we got our independence. What do we do now? And there was even a talk about having George Washington be some kind of American king. There was talk about perhaps no union at all, maybe just 13 different states. In fact, the French government, our allies during the war, was actually prepared to send 13 different ambassadors to all 13 different states. So even though it's very clear to us today that these 13 states would join together and form a union, in 1787, right at the very end of the American Revolutionary War, that was not at all obvious to the Americans at the time. And so what becomes obvious is that a new government needs to be drawn up if the 13 colonies were going to join together. Throughout 1787 and 1789, the great debate throughout all 13 colonies was of this new constitution that had been drawn up by a constitutional convention. These were representatives from all 13 colonies that had gotten together to form a new government. And what they come up with is pretty dramatic. One of the things that they do have to compromise, though, is on how states are going to be represented in this new government. This is something you guys will hear a lot more of when we get to when you guys get to government next year. I will be your government teacher next year, so a lot of this stuff we will hear again only when examining it from a government point of view. But one of the things they have to compromise on is how states are represented. One group said that states should be represented based on their population. The other one said that all states should be represented equally. Well, a compromise was drawn up, and the states eventually each got what they wanted. There was the Congress, where states are represented, would be broken into two parts. One was called the Senate, where every state would be represented equally. Every state gets 2 representatives regardless of their size. The other house, called the House of Representatives, states will be represented by population. In other words, depending on how many people you had in your state was proportionate to how many representatives you would have in the House of Representatives. Now, the other compromise that had to be reached was in the House that's determined by population, would slaves be counted? Well, unfortunately, there was a compromise reached there too, and that is only 3/5 of the slave population, in other words, approximately a 3/5 fraction of each person would be counted for the purpose of population. And so already very early on, slavery is becoming an issue that the Americans are having to wrestle with when it comes to the founding of the country. There were those that staunchly opposed it, but they didn't feel that it was an issue that they wanted to tackle at this point when they were trying to get some of those big southern states where slavery was into the Union. Now, one of the other problems that people had with the Constitution is there was nowhere listed a Bill of Rights. What were people's rights under this new Constitution? Well, finally that was added, and that was what people who opposed the new Constitution needed to support it. And finally, it was ratified. In 1788, the Constitution has its first President of the United States, and that, of course, is George Washington. George Washington had served in the Continental Congress as a representative of Virginia. He had served as the general of the Continental Army during the Revolution, and now Americans look to him as their first president. Very early on, Washington realized that being a president of a country was very different than being the general of an army. He had to compromise. He had to work with people. And one of the early debates early on was what they called strict or loose constructionism. In other words, how do we determine what the powers of the Congress, the President, and the third branch, the Supreme Court, were supposed to be? And there were some that said, well, if it isn't written in the Constitution, then you can't do it. Those are called strict constructionists. Then there were those that said, well, it's just kind of a guideline as to what the powers of the president should be. Those were loose constructionists. And very early on, it seemed that the strict constructionists were the ones that were kind of in charge, and they were very restrictive of what the president could and couldn't do. Early on, however, Washington had a member in his cabinet. Cabinet, of course, are the advisors to the president that worked with him to help try and get this whole country started. One of them was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was not a strict constructionist. He was a loose constructionist. In other words, he said, well, these are just guidelines, and some of the things that we need to have is a unified currency. In other words, we need to all be using the same kind of money. We need to have a national bank to stabilize the economy. Now, there were those that, of course, opposed that, and one of them was Washington's Secretary of State, the very man who had written the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson opposed the ideas of Hamilton, and it was at this point that we see the beginning of the first two political parties. One were called the Hamiltonian Federalists, or just the Federalists, and the other one were called the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, or just the Democrats, or the Democratic Republicans. Where we first see this divide is in the election of 1796. On one side, you have the Federalists being represented by Washington's Vice President, John Adams, and on the other side, his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who's actually a very close friend of Adams at the time, runs against him, along with his own party, known as the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, or just the Democratic Republicans. And it is the first time that we see a real political divide in American history. One of the things that makes it worse is that John Adams is a very independent-minded president. He does not necessarily work and play well with others, even with people in his own party. And one of the first things that we start to see happen during this time is John Adams responds to an issue that's happening internationally. What's beginning to happen during this time is a conflict brewing between the United States of America and Britain and France. At this time, what's happening is that the British and French are essentially kidnapping American sailors and impressing them, as they say. That's what that term means, impressed. They're essentially kidnapping American sailors, taking American goods off American ships, and then stealing it and enslaving American soldiers. This problem gets to be such an issue that John Adams feels that he has to maintain loyalty at home of people who are criticizing him during a time of potential war. And he just narrowly misses it. He narrowly misses having to go to war with either France or Great Britain. However, in the meantime, he passes something called the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These acts seem to trample on the Constitution, basically saying you can't say what you want, and tramples on people's right to freedom of speech. At the end of John Adams' first term, he is not reelected, and the very popular Thomas Jefferson comes in as the next president of the United States. And this is a big deal because it's the first time when two people of opposing political powers come into office and there's a peaceful exchange of power. Once in the presidency, Jefferson starts to really make the presidency his own. One of the things that happens during his presidency is that the Supreme Court decides its own power of judicial review, its own power to decide the constitutionality of laws. And he also makes a large purchase of land called the Louisiana Purchase. This is basically almost doubles the size of the American continent. Interestingly enough, that's a power that the Constitution never said the president had, and yet Jefferson, who used to be a loose constructionist, went ahead and bought that land from Napoleon Bonaparte back in France. Now, as we mentioned, this problem with American sailors being captured continues to be a problem. One of the things that Jefferson does to combat it is he passes what's called the Embargo Act. It basically blocks any trade with either Britain or France. And because America's economy still is very fragile and very young at this point, all it really does is it sends the American economy plunging, going down and suffering. Basically, it's proved completely ineffective. Britain and France had plenty of other places where they could trade without having to trade with the United States, and as a result, it eventually was repealed. Jefferson ends up spending his second term very much haunted by this issue of what to do with this growing crisis with either Britain or France, although it's becoming more of an issue with Great Britain than with France. Back in Europe, the British and French are at war again with Napoleon, who is now, of course, Emperor of France, along with all of its other territory controlled, constantly fighting with Britain and its various other European allies. And so for a while, it seems that America doesn't have to deal with this. But at the same time, the British, still out there, every once in a while, is stealing American ships and impressing American sailors. In 1808, a new president comes in after Jefferson had served 2 terms. By the way, that becomes a tradition, and a tradition that had started with Washington. Washington could have served a lot longer, but at the end of 2 terms, he steps down. And clear from them, almost clear into the middle of the 20th century, presidents refused to serve more than 2 terms. So at the end of his 2 terms, Jefferson steps down. Another Jeffersonian comes in. This time it's James Madison, the author of the Bill of Rights, who comes in and is president. And immediately James Madison is faced with this crisis of what to do with American sailors and cargo being stolen by the British. There are people in the American government that want to go to war with Great Britain over this. And in 1812, they get their wish. After years of abuse of American trade ships and Navy ships, the American government finally is able to persuade James Madison to declare war on Great Britain. Now, the War of 1812 is largely a political war. It's not really a war over territory. It's a war over politics, and it's a war over this issue of primarily trade. And it's also a regional war. The war takes place in mostly up in the Northeast and down in the South. In the Northeast, the British are actually very successful against the American army. At one point, they even burned down Washington, D.C., burning down the White House. This, of course, is the famous story of President Madison's wife, Dolly, running out of the White House with Washington's famous portrait that's on your $1 bill out and saving it. However, down in the South, the American forces, which are kind of a mixture of regular soldiers, ex-slaves, Native American Indians, and pirates, are all under the command under a young general by the name of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is in command of this kind of mishmash of soldiers down in New Orleans, where the British are looking to invade and essentially cut the American territory in 2 by taking control of the Mississippi River. While the British are unprepared for what the Americans have waiting for them, and are completely taken by surprise by how well fortified the Americans are. And at the famous Battle of New Orleans, the Americans beat the British yet again. It's at this point that we finally have an understanding between the British government and the Americans, and that is that North America, once and for all, is the territory of the United States and not Great Britain, save for Canada, which even to this day still remains a loyal British subject. But the famous Treaty of Ghent in 1815 officially ends the war. And this really ends this first period of American history where America has gone through a period where it has won its independence, founded a new government, and even in a kind of an awkward situation, even defended that government. And so we see here the first chapter in American history. Okay, what I'd like you guys to do here is at the end of your notes, or in that section at the bottom of the digital section, is to write a summary paragraph. And in this paragraph, what I'd like you guys to do is to talk about how had America changed. I've got some hints in these three different categories. How had America changed politically? How had it changed economically? And how had it changed socially? I want you guys to take a look at the helps there for each of those categories. Look back in your notes and give a look and see how America has changed. I'll give you guys a hint. In this particular situation, we're looking primarily at political change, although one could argue that the other two can be included as well. But like I said, read over the hints. For example, under political change, include decisions the government took on important political issues such as the economy, social issues such as those of race, women, immigrants, relations with other foreign countries. That would include wars, peace treaties, trade, all that kind of stuff. Economic change would be to look at how individuals or groups affected the country's economy. We mentioned Alexander Hamilton very early on wanting a unified currency throughout all 13 states, a bank of the United States to kind of stabilize the American economy. We see a growth of American territory as a result of this as well. Social change. What had changed for Americans as a people when we look at this period of time? So guys, all I'm asking for is one paragraph. I am looking to grade this. Please understand that this is 1/3 of your grade for your PowerPoints. Each PowerPoint is worth 30 points. And your summary paragraph here at the end is 10 of those 30 points. So please make sure you do this. These summary paragraphs are also going to help you when at the end of this quarter in October, you're going to be writing a quarter essay talking about how America had changed throughout our entire period of time that we will have studied up until that point. So please keep that in mind. These notes and these summary paragraphs are going to be very valuable for you. So finish that up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of the background music in the background. So kind of sets us in the mood, puts us in the period. And of course you have the PDF of the notes to look back on in case this was a little bit too fast for you. We'll see you next time.